Welcome and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, both in person and online. A special welcome and word of thanks to all of our ACHS members. If you're not yet a member, please consider becoming one today. $40 a year for new members and $50 thereafter. Your membership helps make our events possible and supports the mission of the Society. My name's Pat Hayes. I'm on the Board of Managers here, and it's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. This event actually is part of our local history series. We're always looking for ways to promote the rich history of Catholicism in our area in Philadelphia, and to open the house to those who are doing exciting research and have stories to tell. That's how tonight's event came to be. We are currently planning our 2024-2025 season. So if there are any individuals who have research that they might wish to share, please speak to me or Tom Resnick, or reach out to us at info@amchs.org. Our last event of the season will be our annual garden party on Friday, June 7th from 6 to 9. Always a fun time. It's a great opportunity to welcome people to the Society, and we hope that you can join us. For those tuning in online, please use the Q&A feature to add questions for our speaker. So, tonight's speaker is Leo Vaccaro, a proud graduate of St. Joseph's Preparatory School. He earned his BA from Gettysburg College and his MA in history from Villanova University. He's currently completing a book project celebrating the upcoming 175th anniversary of the founding of the Prep, which focuses on the Church of the Jesu, as well as the school itself and the neighborhood. Passionate about Civil War history, he has taught at St. Joseph's Prep since 2011 and is also an adjunct at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Please welcome our guest speaker tonight.
Thanks. So I am a high school teacher, so this would actually make me more comfortable if you interrupted me or put your hands up or anything like that. You don't have to feel like I'm just going to read straight through and not react in any way. And so if there's something that you want me to talk more about, we only have 3 hours tonight to get through this. So feel free to ask me about that. I need to start with gratitude. This is something I've learned from one Jesuit in particular, who is Father George Burr, who is here, if you could raise your hand. Thank you, Father George Burr. Yeah, who said once, I think at a faculty meeting, that it's always important to start with gratitude. It helps you maintain a spiritual happiness, and I totally agree with that sentiment. I'm very grateful that I had this opportunity to work this past year on the history of St. Joseph's Prep, the history of the Jesu Church, and to talk with also a few people who are in this room about that history and that past. And I need to especially focus that my principal, Andy Kavakos, helped make that happen. So if you can give Andy Kavakos a round of applause for making that happen too. Thank you. Yeah. And lastly, I am very grateful to be here with the American Catholic Historical Society. I was really honored that I was asked to come and give this talk. So thanks to Tom and Pat for helping make this happen. So if you could give them a round of applause too, I really appreciate it. I know that this is a important, prestigious organization, and I had 2 goals that I wanted to do with this presentation. One was to tell this story, to talk about the past, and to expose a lot of us to this history of what happened at St. Joe's during the Civil War and make it entertaining. And on the other hand, I wanted to make sure that I respected the Society to put some academic interest into it as well. So there's going to be a little balance of both things. Hopefully, that's at least my intention of what I'm trying to do here. I set The setting pretty large in scope, not just particularly one institution, but looking at what was happening with the Jesuit mission in Philadelphia during the Civil War. And so since I am a proud St. Joe's Prep graduate and teacher, and I see we've got, thank you for representing St. Joe's Prep here for attending. And I know there's alumni as well, so thank you for attending. But St. Joe's Prep was one part of this larger network of missions, and the people that were running that network did not see them as all distinct organizations in the 19th century. And if you were to go back to Philadelphia in 1860, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you had to, you would see that Felix Barblin was at the center of those different organizations. And I think it's cool that he's also right over here too. So he's on the wall of the society. So Felix Barblin was an incredible man and priest. He was born in France. He came to the United States in 1830. He entered the Jesuit order in France and escaped conscription. When he arrived in the United States, as far as we know, he couldn't speak any English, and he maintained a large connection with his family at home. So we have a bunch of his letters that he was writing to his sisters. So he gives us also an international way of looking at the story, and he does talk about the Civil War and what was going on at the time in those letters. So I will talk more about that later. I do not assume that everyone understands what the Jesuit order are, although I appreciate that we have representatives directly from the society here with us. And there's a trick with talking about the history of the Society of Jesus, which is that they are the upstarts of the Catholic orders, and they did some distinctive things historically, including that they kept their last names, they didn't pray the hours, and they were not a monastic group that was cloistered or something like that. So just to give a little introduction. The Jesuits came to Philadelphia. 1733 is the commonly cited date. That's why our address at St. Joe's Prep is 1733 West Yard, for example. They chose that on purpose, but by the 18th century, Old St. Joe's, only a couple blocks from where we are right now, you could go visit and see it. Tucked away behind the Quaker Almshouse. And interestingly, they did set up schools at Old St. Joe's on that campus. So although St. Joe's Prep commonly says, and St. Joe's University, how many Hawks from the university are here? Can you raise your hand? Okay, thank you also for coming. So St. Joe's Prep, St. Joe's College, we say 1851 as the established date for both institutions, because in September of 1851, that's when official classes began for the college. But we know that there were schools there, and there was even a new school building that was under construction in 1789. So there's a longer tradition of Jesuit education in Philadelphia, just that the official auspices of the college were not set up. Let me talk for 1 second about what it was like to go to that college, quote unquote college. And I'm putting it in quotation marks in this presentation because between 1851 and the Civil War, there was only one man, and it was an all-boys school that even got a degree. And that should tell us something about what they were trying to do with that educational venture. And it informs us for what happened to some of these guys during the Civil War, which is that they were not necessarily interested in walking away with a diploma. They were interested in getting a ground for education, a foundation for education, and then going on to professional degrees. So entering in and getting their MD or becoming a lawyer afterwards. They were not as interested in that generation to go get a bachelor's degree from St. Joe's, and they went on to other institutions to go get their professional degrees if they wanted to. So there was only one graduate of St. Joe's before the Civil War, and there were a whole lot of alumni. There were a whole lot of guys that went to Clemson. The other trick to that is that we have the list of the guys that were there in September of 1851, but they were all kids. So one of the guys I'm going to talk about today in the third hour, was 12 years old when he was there in September. And then he ended up in the Civil War in the 1860s. They also established, it looks initially through Felix Barberlin, they established a school for African Americans, Black Catholics in Philadelphia. And that school opened in 1858, although they had already started a mass for Black Catholics in the 1840s. And the school eventually expanded not too far from here. Obviously, we're in the neighborhood where all these people were, and everybody involved in the Civil War story of St. Joe's. So in 1847, Mass was held for Philadelphia's Black community Sundays, 8:30 a.m. at Old St. Joe's. And so we're talking about a multiracial community, although it was segregated in the actual facilities that were taking place in different outreach efforts. Okay, so let me talk a little philosophy, historiography, and one pop culture reference here to try to set the stage a little bit. If you talk about the Civil War, you really do have to identify that there was a right and a wrong side to the Civil War. That's my opinion. I am stealing it from Frederick Douglass. So if you don't agree with me, you're also not agreeing with Frederick Douglass on this viewpoint, the most important social political thinker of the 19th century, the most photographed man of the 19th century. And he spoke multiple times about what the Civil War actually meant in the aftermath of it, and basically argued that there was a right and a wrong side to the Civil War. The South was wrong. The Confederacy was wrong, to be more precise and correct in what actually took place, and they should not be honored for what they were actually fighting for during the Civil War. It doesn't mean that there weren't brave people who fought battles in the South. Doesn't mean that this is what Frederick Douglass says. So I'm not going to read it for you. You could read it. But doesn't mean that there weren't people that were trapped in that situation in the Confederacy. It was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight in the South as well. The Civil War also was very clearly about the issue of slavery, which explains, I think, what some of the themes that I'm going to talk about, how people evolved through the Civil War and what they thought about the political arrangements of this country. And if you're paying attention to the historiography in America today or within the profession today, you are going to see that people are referring to the Civil War increasingly as the Second American Revolution. And so here we are in Old City, so famous for its colonial history, its American Revolutionary history, but I am a huge Civil War nerd, so I have to emphasize that we also are a huge Civil War city and a Civil War city of great consequence with the Second American Revolution. I'm throwing in some other book recommendations along the way too, because I can't stop being a high school teacher as well. But this book, I think, is one of the best. It's more than 15 years old now, of tracing how American soldiers evolved in their opinions of the war throughout time and turned the Civil War experience into something that was a sectional conflict. And then by the summer of 1863, American troops are talking about how this is expiation for the sins of the country and a redemptive aspect to the war in order to transform the country into a new birth of freedom. And of course, Lincoln latches on to the viewpoints of his soldiers with his second inaugural address in 1865, which encapsulates that same philosophy. In terms of Catholics in the Civil War, it's not that people are not talking about Catholics in the Civil War, but I stole someone else's historiography from a great book of William Kurtz talking about Catholics. And he makes this point, you can read for yourself, where he says, there's not a lot of people that are talking just about a religious perspective of the Civil War, and even less so for Catholics in the North. Part of that is demographics. Only about 7% of the United States was Catholic in 1860. It was a conspicuous minority, as I know a lot of you from the American Catholic Historical Society know. This is the bread and butter thing that's difficult to, I think, explain to the public, that today, Roman Catholicism is the largest Christian church in America, but in the Civil War era, it's a very small group, which also made this project fun, to be honest, because it meant that all these people knew each other. Really, there was 7% of the country, I understand, is 1 million people, but a lot of the Catholic clergy, there were only really a few clergy in Philadelphia, not many, you're good, not many Jesuits precisely at that time. The Catholic Church explodes in population right after the Civil War time period and goes on this huge building campaign in the Gilded Age. Dr. Kurtz, in that book, puts a thesis forward that says, essentially, Catholics responded to the Civil War as a minority group in America, initially in the early phase of the war, to enlist, to get involved, to project their value within the nation and try to prove that they were as good Americans or patriotic Americans. I'm talking about the Northern group here. And then as the war continued on, they grew upset with the conduct of the war. And I'm going to talk more about that with what specifically happened with our guys who were in military service as well. Ultimately, his thesis also includes the idea that the creation of a separate Catholic world in America in the late 19th century, creating a Catholic ghetto is the word that we're using here. It was partly a result of backlash of people saying those Catholics are not loyal during the war. Those Catholics voted Democrat in 1864. They voted for McClellan. They didn't vote for Lincoln. And people may have reacted to that to say, we're going to build our own churches, our own schools. We're going to continue down on that path. So that's kind of the historical discussion that already exists out there. This is the context, and I'm summarizing this very quickly. There's many different books I could get into, but you're not here to just learn historiography. We're trying to talk some local history too. I did think it was curious that maybe the most important piece of American pop culture in the Civil War, if Gone with the Wind, is about Catholics in the South. And I don't think that there's a lot of Catholic in the North popular understanding in general. And I'd like to change that a little bit, to, at least today, to talk a little bit more about what Catholics in the North were looking like. So let's talk a little bit about Catholicism in America in some context. The Jesuits who were in Philadelphia were part of the Maryland province, and Maryland traditionally is the Catholic colony. And those Jesuits did enslave laborers, and there was a large sale of those enslaved laborers that was very controversial even at the time in 1838. And so there is a whole bunch of different opinions among the Jesuit community as to what slavery meant and the politics of slavery. The second president of St. Joseph's College, who had actually been born in Ireland and educated in Rome, Father James Ryder, who was buried out of St. John's, very well-educated man, but also a firm defender of the system of slavery, and is quoted on the record in Richmond. And there's other historiographical things going on that after Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, people calcified in their opinions of slavery, and a lot of the pro-slavery faction in the South and across the United States started to defend slavery, whereas the Enlightenment ideas of the Jeffersonian years kind of faded away. And people were actually making pro-slavery arguments after 1831, whereas that wasn't so common before 1831, even if people enslaved laborers or were benefiting from the system of slavery. So James Ryder is one of the guys that got swept up in that ideological change. These are two of my favorite illustrations from the 19th century. They are Civil War era, but they're a little bit after the war. So perhaps claiming that Kurtz idea of what people thought of Catholics after the war. But another thing you should think about with the 19th century is that Jesuits in particular often were seen as anti-liberal forces, as reactionary forces. Whether or not that was true is a whole nother discussion, and whether that or not that was a case-by-case sort of basis is a whole nother discussion. But among Americans, even among many Catholics, they saw the Jesuits as being part of Pius IX's efforts to fight the unification of Italy, to fight against the expansion of democracy. And so we have a couple different illustrations on the right. That's one from Thomas Nast of Pius IX looking from the top of St. Peter's and pointing to America with his army of Catholics to go and invade. And on the left, we have a Jesuit priest in a confessional listening to the confession of an American elected official with a telegram in one hand, sending it directly to Rome, the secrets of what's going on. So in Pennsylvania, too, there was a big transition in the Civil War era as to the political arrangement. So some more context of what's taking place. And perhaps the most important figure in Civil War era Pennsylvania is the guy pictured there, Thaddeus Stevens, is the founder of my other alma mater, Gettysburg College. So I'm very proud of him. But the man, before becoming a Republican, was a nativist. And so there were a lot of nativists, people that campaigned against allowing Catholics to come into the United States, who got absorbed into the new Republican Party. And so this is part of the problem for why a lot of Catholics tended to vote Democrat during the Civil War era, because they did not like the bedfellows that they had in the Republican Party. So there's some tensions that were going on there with the nativists at that time. And I have a quote from Thaddeus Stevens talking about the election of 1860. Does anyone know which guy he's saying? We will never in Pennsylvania vote for that guy who wanted to be a nativist. It's actually not Lincoln. That's a trick question, probably. This is a difficult question. Anybody know which New Yorker, Republican Party? Seward, very good. A+, Mr. Connors there. Yeah. Yeah. I did find it to be really funny looking through the newspapers that there was even a candidate. So there were those terrible 1844 anti-Catholic riots with churches being burned down and attacked in the city of Philadelphia. And there was a nativist movement. A man was sent to Congress from Philadelphia as part of the Nativist Party. The first mayor after the consolidation of Philadelphia in 1854 was an anti-Catholic Whig, not a member of a nativist party, but promised he would have a all-native police force, no Irish in the police force that he was going to establish. And I even found this guy, very funny 19th century political ad from October of back in those days, October were the local elections, very dangerous election day, politicking going on. And this guy, George Washington Reed, ran as part of the anti-Jesuit party, not just nativist, but said, I'm an anti-Jesuit. And I knew that somebody, well, I suspected that somebody would ask me whether he won or not. So I went in a little rabbit hole this past week. Not only did he lose, but long after the election, they fished a body out of the Delaware River that had that guy's ballots in his pocket. So the guy that was stuffing the ballot box for the anti-Jesuit party ended up in Camden, New Jersey, washed up. So maybe, yeah. Tough time. See, this is why you don't want to be back in 1860s Pennsylvania or Philadelphia. The other trick is that the Jesuits were a international organization, and that in the United States, they were in the North and the South. And of course, their oldest university at Georgetown had a lot of Confederates that went through there. And so recent historiography suggests, why weren't the Jesuits actually just embracing the Confederacy? That's the real question, is not why were they loyal in the North, but why is it that they didn't actually say, we want the Confederacy to win? Because many of them were in the South, Spring Hill in the South. They were in New Orleans. They were in Georgetown, like I said, and they were associated with a reactionary vision, and they had enslaved labor. So it's a real question. So that leads to my thesis. This is the argument I'm going to try to make, which is that within that context, it is sort of surprising that St. Joe's was such a pro-Union, even at times pro-Lincoln community. I'm also going to argue that it doesn't really seem to me that St. Joe's became more of a interior-focused group. It doesn't appear to me like they reacted to the Civil War by deciding to create only a distinct Catholic space. It seems like that is something that just continued happening, and they didn't have quite that same negative reaction to how they were felt during the wartime. Also, St. Joe's is most responsible for the most important Catholic monument in the Civil War, which I will talk about more in a second. Okay, so Philadelphia in 1860 was the fourth largest city in the world, only behind London, Paris, and New York. And its geographic location to a lot of the battlefields and to the Mason-Dixon line meant that it was a very important urban center during the Civil War. It's a very important Civil War city. And this map here from Frank Taylor's History of Philadelphia during the Civil War marked out a lot of the different camp locations and the hospitals. And I'm mostly going to be talking about what was happening down here, where we are now at Old St. Joe's, and up to where the hospital moved, which was also started by Felix Barber. So here's a map from 1860 that you can see the neighborhood that we are in right now. And you have Old St. Joe's up here, and down at 4th and Lombard, you would have had the school for African Americans. And then up at where basically St. Joe's Prep is now over here, this is where the hospital was during the Civil War, moved up there. So I've got 4 protagonists to focus on. Felix Barblin being the first one, the Hilary Bronner, who was the superior from the Daughters of Charity at St. Joseph's Hospital during the Civil War, Charles Brightly, who was in our class, the first class that joined St. Joe's 1851, and Edmund Randall, who was there later in the 1850s as a student. So let's talk about what they saw during the Civil War. So in 1860, the college had actually moved back to its original location at Wellings Alley. It was at Juniper and Filbert Streets for a brief time near where City Hall is now. And the Jesuit Superior General attempted to keep American Jesuits neutral during the Civil War, but Barblin had already been on the record as being an avowed Unionist. In 1856, he wrote, quote, "As long as the Union lasts, our holy religion will flourish and spread. Should the Union dissolve, then Catholics would suffer in some states where fanaticism exists." In September of 1861, when President Lincoln ordered a day of fasting, a national day of fasting, Barblin invited a singer to mark the occasion with a patriotic song. And this is the story of that patriotic song. He looked at the lyrics of the hymn and said, "This must be a pro-Confederate hymn of Hail Columbia, because it says, 'Let right, not might, prevail.'" And he reacted to that to say, well, that sounds like you're against the industrial North and you agree with what the Confederate cause actually is. So he actually took out a pencil, scratched out right and might, and changed the lyrics to "Let love, not hate, prevail," in order to emphasize that where his allegiance actually was, although the superior told them to actually remain neutral during that time. Since he was from France, like I mentioned earlier, the nation did not have a long history of African slavery within France, although it did within the colonies. It probably was shocking to him in 1830 when he arrived in Virginia and saw the system of American slavery that was then taking place across the country. When he was working in Georgetown at Holy Trinity, you can see here, this is from his own hand, he was baptizing enslaved laborers in what's now Washington, D.C. And interestingly, he was putting in the baptismal record their family history. So there's a historian that's working on this right now, going through those family histories and seeing what, wondering too, why was Felix Barblin so keen to actually include those family histories, whereas not everybody else was doing that at the time. Yes.
You said that the French didn't have the institution of slavery, but they owned Haiti.
Yeah, in the colonies they did. Yeah, in their colonies. And it is possible that he did run into people of color in France when he was growing up. But, and he actually lived, he was born in a town that wasn't too far from the leading French abolitionist, who I believe was Abby Gregory, although my French pronunciation is no good. That's probably not right. But so he was perhaps from a more enlightened tradition about the history of slavery at the time. During the Civil War, he wrote to his sister in France, quote, "Oh dear, we are at war, and unfortunately civil war." He went on to say, "We do not like slavery," but he also seemed worried what would happen when it ended, quote, "To whites and blacks with great prudence, wise moderation, and material concessions are necessary. What will the consequences of this fratricidal war be?" He did comment on what was going on in wartime Philadelphia, Like he mentioned that there were 16,000 women busy sewing for the soldiers. And quote, for our part, we Catholics continue to be devoted and generous. He also did comment on the sisters' work. Possibly he's talking about his own hospital that they set up of St. Joseph's Hospital. But here's some quotes from his letters. There is an interesting story there's a few Notre Dame people here. Who else is a Notre Dame person? Okay. There were a few brothers of the Holy Cross, right? From the Congregation of the Holy Cross who were teaching at St. Joe's College during the war. And is it Soren, Father Soren, the founder, wrote to them and said, you have to come back to Indiana because we worked out a carve-out deal from the Conscription Act of 1863. So you won't be conscripted if you come back. And there's some speculation that that was actually made up, that he was just doing that to get his guys back to Indiana and out of Philadelphia. So he does. Felix Barbalin did talk about that. And like I mentioned earlier, he did write to his sisters back in France, giving more of an international perspective of the war. When Lincoln's casket came to Philadelphia on its tour before he was buried in Springfield in 1865, St. Joe's students did march in the procession. So this is a photo of Philadelphia's procession. It was a huge moment in Philadelphia's history that he laid in state in Independence Hall. And it actually does seem like a huge chunk of the city actually walked past the casket in honor. But there is a record that St. Joe students were involved in that procession. For each one of these characters, I also will give a brief update to what you might see about them today. So in terms of Felix Barbalin today, skipping ahead, he's got this beautiful building in the center of St. Joe's University campus. That's Barbalin Hall, is named after him. He has a nice monument over at Old St. Joe's and a statue of him in the courtyard. Okay, what about the hospital? So during the American Civil War, it's estimated that 1 out of every 5 nuns, or 1 out of every 5 nurses in the American Civil War were actually Catholic nuns. And one of the major groups that contributed towards the nursing of American troops during the Civil War were the Daughters of Charity. And supposedly 270 Daughters of Charity served either on battlefields or in hospitals. These are the Daughters of Charity that were at Satterley Hospital in West Philadelphia, which is now, there's a monument to them, although it doesn't mention them explicitly, out in Clark Park. So that's where that photo was taken during the Civil War. At St. Joseph's Hospital, between 16th and 17th on the south side of Girard, this is what the architect's rendering would have looked like. This is apparently roughly what it would have looked like in the 1860s. The Daughters of Charity were also tasked with taking over that hospital during the Civil War. And they built a new wing. I'm going to have some audience participation here because I know there's a lot of smart historians. There's 3 names who are on the general staff of the hospital. That one of them actually has a typo on it. It's not me, it's the paper. It's the Philadelphia Inquirer in the 1860s. But does anyone note 3 doctors there that are particularly noteworthy to have served at that hospital? I guess the print's kind of small for. Yes, yeah, S. Weir Mitchell. I think they wrote, that's the typo. They put J there, but S. Weir Mitchell is one. What about him? Oh, okay. I actually didn't include him. See, this is that's even a good one I should put in there. Yeah, there's 2 more that I was thinking. So we had 4. Gross. Yeah, that's the Gross Clinic, Samuel Gross. And then there's a real big Civil War name. Yeah, it's McClellan. It's George McClellan's brother. So interestingly, there were controversies with what institutions physicians were going to be involved with in the 1850s and 60s in Philadelphia. And I thought it was really interesting that we ended up, and I chose these 3 to focus on. We have S. Weir Mitchell, who unfortunately is perhaps best known for inspiring the Yellow Wallpaper, the short story of the rest treatment. And he's also one of the proponents of phantom limb theory because of his work during the Civil War at Turner Lane Hospital. So he's pictured there. I could not find a good photo or any photo of George McClellan's brother, John McClellan. The story is that their father was a doctor in Philadelphia and they only wanted to pay for medical school for one of them. So George went to West Point and became Lincoln's disappointing commander that he fired twice, and then ran against Lincoln in 1864, but his brother was the doctor. And you can see there's a PA marker over at that Jefferson University Wawa. That's where their house was. And then the greatest of American paintings, the Gross Clinic of Philadelphia surgeon, Samuel Gross. So there's some connections. There's no photos that I know of the interior of St. Joseph's Hospital during the Civil War, but there are some photos when the Daughters of Charity were there. So this one's from the turn of the last century, and you can see them in the surgical ward. This one seems to be from the 1880s. So this is likely what that hospital would have looked like during the Civil War. A lot of the accounts of St. Joseph's Hospital during the Civil War emphasized how they had a lot of fresh air and that it was up on a hill that people could recuperate. The chapel likely looked like this during the Civil War in the hospital. And I wanted to talk about that eventually 1,000 troops seem to have been sent to St. Joseph's Hospital during the Civil War, including 60 of them immediately after the Battle of Bull Run. And it apparently was so overcrowded that this Philadelphia Inquirer story tells us that some of the patients were on couches and landings and in the stairwells when they went to go visit there as well. The sisters were even involved in military evacuations during the Peninsular Campaign. So that's George McClellan's failed campaign to capture Richmond in 1862, and commissioned a ship as part of the Sanitary Commission and brought them here to Philadelphia. I love this little 19th century article that says, and every soldier has an account to tell of the great battle when they're there. So I like that idea that you can walk up to Jard Avenue and talk to guys about what they actually saw during the war. This is not actually that ship, but that's roughly what it looked like. It's one of the other ones. One puzzle I noticed from the records of St. Joseph's Hospital during the war period is that they treated over 500 gunshot wounds at St. Joseph's Hospital during the war, and I expected to see a whole lot of dysentery and other internal diseases because that's the more common thing that killed people during the Civil War, but that was not the case. So I think that's an interesting way of seeing what that hospital was used for. That I suppose that because of the triage system and moving through the various camp hospitals, that they saw some sort of advantage to treating men that were wounded by gunshots during the war, as opposed to evacuating the guys that had various camp diseases. One of the local Philadelphia entrepreneurs told all the guys at the hospital that he would collect their money and bring them newspapers, and then he never came back again. So swindled them out of their newspapers. Kind of tells you what must have been like to be stuck in that hospital looking for news during the time. And a lot of the care there had to do with getting fresh air and eating good meals and petting the dog that they had in the hospital, as opposed to what you would suggest a scientific method. There's no Joseph Lister tour of America by this point, so people are not washing their hands when they're cutting into people, and there's not a good understanding of what that would take place at that time. Today, it is a condo with a bar and restaurant and mini golf course in the basement. So this is my theme of updating what happened to each one of these places. However, we at St. Joseph's Prep have some artwork from St. Joseph's Hospital, including this beautiful marble statue of our patron that was carried over there. Interestingly, one of our guys who went to St. Joe's was Charles Brightly. His father was a sailor from England and had converted because he became friends with Archbishop Hughes of New York. He was sent to St. Joseph's College and then also remained in a politically connected family, became friends with the Cadwallader family, whose The grandfather of John Cadwalader was one of Washington's generals. His brother was the general that stopped the 1844 riots in Philadelphia, but John was a congressman and wrote the recommendation to send Charles to West Point after he was at St. Joe's. So that's him in his cadet uniform. He graduated in the June of 1861 class. He was number 29 in his class, but the guy who was last in his class, number 34, you may have heard of him, was George Armstrong Custer. So last in his class. Charles Brightly left West Point, almost immediately got married at St. Vincent de Paul in Germantown, ended up training and mustering in troops. He's a rare Civil War story because he was in the regular army. He was in the 4th United States. Most Civil War soldiers were in their volunteer regiments for each state, but he had a commission in the U.S. Army, which also meant that his rank was typically lower because of the pension system, because of all the competition that was going on. So he's mostly training troops, although he received a citation for his regiment at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He unfortunately was sick for a lot of the war, but they put him in charge of the 4th United States when they went into battle at the Battle of Wilderness, which we are at the 160th anniversary of that yesterday. And he was shot in the neck. So here's some illustrations. These are actually at Boston College of someone that illustrated what the battle looked like at the Wilderness. He was transported back to Philadelphia. The papers in Philadelphia, and these are photographs of guys who were also wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness. The papers reported that the wound was not dangerous, but unfortunately, this is the letter from his father to the Army, notifying the Army that he did die in Germantown in June of 1864 from his wounds. And he is on our memorial at St. Joe's Prep, which we just recently put up. So that's one of our stories. Another one of our alumni would be Edmund Randall, a perhaps more typical American Catholic story for your Civil War experience, which includes that he enlisted in the 116th Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment. He was apparently the first officer to show up at the camp off of Lancaster Pike. This is the only photo I know of the 116th, which I think is a perfect Civil War photo because it's not them with their flags going into battle. It's the drudgery and the mud and the disgustingness of what that experience would have been like. His regiment links up with the Irish Brigade. And if you want to read more about the Irish Brigade, I do recommend this published version of a man that wrote through his memoirs of what they actually experienced. If you know about the Irish, raise your hand if you know about the Irish Brigade. Some Civil War nerds here. Okay, yeah. So unfortunately, the Irish Brigade was sent into a suicidal frontal assault up a hill near Fredericksburg, Virginia, in the Battle of Fredericksburg, and basically destroyed a huge part of the whole brigade and left that experience in tatters. So Edmund Randall never gets over what happens at Fredericksburg. The guy, William McCarter, who wrote that memoir, never got over what happened to them at Fredericksburg. Edmund Randall does survive the war, though. And when his regiment, the 116th Pennsylvania, dedicates a monument in Gettysburg to their efforts, he is asked to go speak. And he gives a very interesting take on what he thought took place during the Civil War. You can read the whole speech online. We're running out of time here, so but for the third hour, you could do that. And I think it's notable that I included this section because he's not a supporter of the lost cause idea. He's not a supporter of total reunion or honoring people that fought on the other side of the battlefield, and instead expresses what he saw in that at Fredericksburg, to be particular, because he did not actually fight at Gettysburg. He had already left by then. That's him in the center of a bunch of St. Joe's students around 1902, because in 1902, for the 50th anniversary of the college, they invited him to come back and speak about his Civil War experiences, and he told a bunch of stories about the guys he ran into who were other St. Joe's guys as well, and he volunteered with the college's cadets. So that's up at 17th and Stiles, where the prep is now. That's the building one of the buildings that burned down in 1966, but he was pictured there with our guys in uniform. Briefly, he did mention that he ran into a spy in Washington, D.C., who was a St. Joe's guy. I have compared everybody from the 1850s who I could find a name from. Well, he specifically said they were in the 1851 class. So I've looked through as many records as known Confederate spies that I could find, and I have not found which guy that actually is. He also mentioned that a St. Joe's guy was the colonel of the 71st Pennsylvania, which is definitely not true. So it was 50 years after he was in high school. He was maybe mixing some things up. Honestly, I think he may have just thought of Charles Brightly, who led a regiment and was killed. He said, I knew this guy that was the colonel of the 71st, and he was killed at Chancellorsville, but I think he confused the two. That instead there was a man running a regiment that was killed at Wilderness. And then in 1902, he may have forgotten. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but it couldn't have been the 71st. I have to talk a little bit, I'm running out of time, but I have to talk a little bit about Thomas Lilly, who did run our African-American ministry and ran the school. Thomas Lilly was involved in enslaving people in the 1830s and saw himself, even though he was from Adams County, Pennsylvania, the same county that Gettysburg is in, he saw himself as a Southerner, and he kept a bunch of diaries, which you can even read online. And when he was sent to Philadelphia in the 1850s, he mostly complained about all these city people and all these foreigners and this French priest he had to work with. But he also was very passionate about the African-American outreach efforts in Philadelphia. He complained about the election of Abraham Lincoln. And let me see if I can find you the quote here. From all appearances, a great misfortune has befallen the country. He is an ignorant, illiterate Black Republican of the worst stamp. He described dining with the Irish Brigade officers at Old St. Joe's on their way back from the Battle of Bull Run, and said basically, well, and they were beat by those Southerners like Jefferson Davis's army. So it's a weird combination of things going on with Thomas Lilly, that he's both involved in an outreach effort with the African-American school. People are referring to him as basically, like literally the Peter Claver of Philadelphia, the Jesuit that's reaching out to work with African-Americans. But he has a lot of pro-Southern sympathies, and then he drops dead in 1863. So it's difficult to figure out exactly what he was thinking. All right, two quick stories after the war. The General William Tecumseh Sherman was a very reluctant Catholic, was sort of forced to become a Catholic. He described his wife as more Catholic than the Pope, and was very annoyed that she raised her children to go to schools that were run by Jesuits. And eventually his son, Thomas, who he really wanted to become a lawyer, hated law and entered the Society of Jesus. Thomas Sherman, who's pictured on the left and the right there, I wanted to compare the two of them on horses, celebrated his first mass at the Church of the Jesu in Philadelphia, the Jesuit church that we have at St. Joe's Prep's campus in 1889. The other post-war commemoration that we have that's involved with St. Joe's has to do with what's being illustrated here. At the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Father Corby, also part of the Irish Brigade, blessed the troops going into battle and granted absolution to them. General Mulholland recalled this is what he said during that absolution, that you will only be forgiven of your sins if you don't let the enemy capture your flag and you're brave in battle. And so in 1909, a movement starts out of the Church of the Jesu and out of St. Joseph's College to mark that occasion, that specific moment that took place. And General Mulholland shows up on our campus and says, I think that we should have a statue to commemorate that. And there's a national push to commemorate the Corby statue, which is pictured there. The president of St. Joseph's College at the time, Father Lyons, speaks at the dedication. This paper from San Francisco pontificates on what this actually means for Catholicism in general and Catholic experience of the war. That's me in 2005 with St. Joe's Prep students as a kid, a senior in high school at that actual statue. So at that time and my whole time as an undergrad at Gettysburg College, I did not know. I just assumed that Notre Dame University built that statue because they built their own the following year, a copy of it, but actually it had a lot to do with us. I'm not going to just restate my thesis. You can argue amongst yourselves if I proved it or not. Instead, I wanted to throw a few observations out there. I think it's funny, a lot of people talking about working on this project have said to me, well, I'm not really all that interested about an all-boys school in the 1800s. That's not particularly interesting to everybody. But my argument to that is there's a lot more going on throughout these local institutions and within these archives that connect to these larger historiographical questions and larger questions of the past. And if you look into these local institutions, and I know that the American Catholic Historical Society has done a lot to try to promote this, you will find a lot of interesting things that connect to these bigger problems. I do like working with Jesuit sources too, because they can give us an international, maybe even a global perspective on the political movements, the war, what was going on at the time, beyond just a local interest. So although Felix Barbalin might be our guy here in Philadelphia, he's also corresponding with Rome. He's corresponding, with the Vatican, namely he's corresponding with his sister in Paris. So it gives us a bigger perspective. And one last epilogue before we can take some questions, hopefully. I also, in this project, looked through the experience of the Second World War at St. Joe's Prep, and the 1943 yearbook has a 4-page spread about St. Joe's Prep's contributions to wars of the past, and had all this information about a lot of what I just said about what happened during the Civil War with St. Joseph's College. So it sort of reminded me that even though this might seem distant to a lot of people now and a matter of trivia, it was something that was really important to people and wasn't as quickly forgotten as we might imagine. So I've gone over my time, but hopefully there are a bunch of questions that we have. I know you have some online too. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. All right, that was a lot. Yeah.
Feel free to field the questions, but you may have to repeat them.
Okay, yeah, if there's some that are online too. Do you want to do one in person first, or?
I think people need time to type their questions, so we'll encourage people who are listening online to add their questions to the Q&A. But maybe open the room here, and I'll just let you field the question.
Sure, I think Bill had his hand up first. Go ahead.
Were all of your good sources online? Everything available online?
No.
For our students?
No, I wouldn't say that. So the question was, were all the good sources available online? And no, I wouldn't say that, although in terms of looking up the letters, a lot of the Jesuits' letters and diaries eventually ended up in Georgetown University, and many of those have been scanned. So there is a lot that you can do with that. I would say that. Yeah, and I have scanned a lot of stuff too, which I'm hoping to from our collection, and which I'm hoping to put up online as well. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were 7% of Catholic male, 7% of the state.
Yeah.
Are there more Catholics in the South or more Catholics in the North? And do you think that affected sway on which way they went, like were leaning during the Civil War, and did their leanings change during the Civil War?
Those are great questions. I don't exactly know the breakdown North and South during the Civil War. However, so the question is, were there more Catholics in the North or South? I have to restate for the people online too, in case but the question was, are there more in the North or the South in the Civil War? And also, did it have a bigger influence on the North or the Southern cause? Is that the question? Okay. My answer to the second part of your question, I think, would be actually that in the South, there was more of a cultural association. You had General Beauregard was a prominent Catholic that was well known at the time. A lot of people in New Orleans, of course, were Catholic. At Spring Hill, the Jesuits were there in the South. So in a lot of ways, I do think a lot of people were more prone to associate the Confederacy with some sort of allegiance to a reactionary ultramontanist politics of the Vatican at the time. However, chaplains and nuns in the North in particular, and the service of Catholics in blue uniforms during the Civil War was a transformational moment, I think, for the church. And I personally don't agree that that led to them being more rejected and carving out completely their own world, although a smarter historian has made that argument, and I give respect to somebody that made that argument as well. Did that answer your question? All right, super. Yeah, follow.
Yeah, so queuing off of that,
Yeah.
I mean, the Jesuits being officially neutral during the Civil War.
Mhm.
There wasn't any evidence to suggest that that was because the Georgetown itself was so dependent on Catholic students, I mean, on Southern students, and to some extent Southern wealth. And Georgetown was always a financially fledgling organization. Is there anything that leans that way that says, in other words, we can't upset the student clientele and maybe even some of the support for Georgetown? That's why we're neutral.
Do you know, so the question is, did Georgetown remain neutral partly because of money issues and making sure that they could have support? Is that correct?
Yeah, because I think a slight or significant majority of the students at Georgetown were Southern.
Mm-hmm. I actually think so. My source for they have to remain neutral is only secondary. You can look at all the letters of the provincial during, that we know that those are online from the provincial. And I'm not 100% sure it was so explicit as some historians have made it out to be, honestly.
Provincial.
I think it's Parchesi, the Italians, yeah. And so that's the other interesting, the other thing about the whole pop culture of Catholics during the Civil War is all these Irish people. And it's funny that you look at the Jesuits and there's not as many, we have a French president here of our college, we have Italians that are running the province, so it's not as clear cut.
That neutral sensitivity makes Bartlett a little bit more of an outlier than you were. So
I agree. Yeah, that would be, so I think that what you're seeing from Bartlett is surprisingly pro-union and surprisingly pro-Lincoln.
and to some extent anti-slave.
Yes, and pro-outreach efforts to African Americans, pro-Second American Revolution is what I'm reading between the lines a little bit, because this is the other thing about local institutions is these aren't public intellectuals. You look at the historiography, you're looking at what Catholic newspapers are saying a lot of the time and what Catholic public intellectuals are saying about the war. But when you look at these local colleges and institutions, I think it's interesting because you see a lot of the boots on the ground.
His only other experience when he came to France was at Georgetown.
Yeah.
Where he was a bursar.
Yeah.
But he also was deemed inappropriate to begin a college, that he was not sufficiently skilled,
Mm-hmm.
but because they couldn't find somebody, he opened up the college. But then they sent in Ryder, who was trained to do this, because he was supposed to be more active.
Mm-hmm.
He failed.
Yeah.
He was removed rather quickly,
Yeah.
even though he had been trained in Europe. And Bartlett ends up being the fourth president again because the thing is fledgling.
Yeah.
So he's deemed as inadequate, unskilled,
Yeah.
second-rate Jesuit. To be
Yeah.
frank.
Although he's the founder of all these
Yeah,
things.
but he's deemed by the leadership of the Jesuits.
Yeah.
So he's an interesting kind of outlier.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, when you talking about Ryder or Bartlett? No, Bartlett was considered kind of second rate. He was
Yeah.
supposed to open the college. Ryder was supposed to come. Ryder was sent to Europe to train.
He didn't have the education that Ryder did.
No.
That was the, I think, a big part of it. But St.
And
Joseph's,
the thing open when it's
Yeah.
almost closed.
and he is instrumental to moving us to where we are at the prep now.
To the
Yeah. And so like him being the founder of the college, the founder of the hospital founded the bank, Beneficial Bank. So like all these connections with what actually happened in the basement of old St. Joseph's shapes the Catholic community in Philadelphia that we have today, for sure. Yeah. I'll have to get one on.
Catholics in Philadelphia respond to the draft, anything like the New York experience.
Good question. So the question is, how did Catholics in particular respond to the draft? Well, first of all, the orders were very worried about it because there weren't carve-outs for religious orders in the official legislation from Congress. So the Conscription Act of 1863 did not say that if you're a priest or brother scholastic, that you wouldn't have to serve. And so the Jesuits worked apparently with Ulysses Grant directly and said, can we work out on some sort of deal? And then in the South, there was a conscription as well. And the Jesuits at Spring Hill worked even with the Confederate authorities to try to establish a carve out for themselves. There were those terrible racially motivated draft riots in the summer of 1863 in New York City. A lot of the speculation as to why that didn't happen in Philadelphia had to do with the bounty system of providing a good amount of funding to make sure that Philadelphians would just sign up and meet their quotas, because each congressional district had a quota during their conscription. And also the consolidation of the city of 1854 and having a more effective policing is often cited as why Philadelphia didn't have draft riots when New York did. So those are, yep, sorry, online question.
Yes, online question. Broad question. What was the most surprising or funny, amusing fact that you found in your research?
Is it limited to Civil War or?
I think it's probably Civil War, but it's wide open.
Well, this is not a direct answer, but one thing I did want to bring up is that I have spent way too much time trying to figure out where Charles Brightly is buried. And I've looked on microfilm, I've looked through cemetery records. I know where his daughter is buried. I know where his wife is buried. I know where his father is buried, his brother who contributed to St. Joseph's College. But he's one of our guys on that plaque that was killed in this war. And I would like to, put a wreath there or talk about that a little bit, but I have no idea where he is. And I realized that he may have been buried in Monument. I think I've proven this is not true, but he may have been buried in Monument Cemetery, which now Temple University is on top of, and they took those tombstones and threw them into the Delaware River. So I don't know where he is. If anybody could help me try to figure that out, I would greatly appreciate if anybody knows where he is. Go ahead, Kat.
So you talked about a number of things having to do with alumni, but I'm curious what impact the war had on the functioning of the school itself.
Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned the visit of the second degree Civil War folks to the cadets. Was that something on campus? Like, what was going on?
Yeah.
Did you lose students who were leaving to join the army? Did you have a rise of student military groups? Like, what was the impact?
Yep.
On the people who
Good
were at
question.
college in
Yeah, so the question is what happened at St. Joseph's College during the actual Civil War? The enrollment dropped, and that happened across the country as well with other Jesuit institutions. It almost ceased to exist, and Barblin just kept it alive. And so we know that there were students there in the 1860s because of those letters about we're losing these teachers, we need new teachers to come in. But they knew that they had a problem, which was space, and they were worried about getting fresh air for their students. They were very worried about bad miasma and getting sick. You look at those Jesuit letters online, it's constant complaints about how sick they were all the time, and they just did not think they were in a literally healthy situation. They wanted to build a campus up on a hill, and that's what they did basically right after the Civil War. So they purchased 1866. They purchased the land, which is roughly where we are at St. Joe's Prep today. Felix Barblin goes up there. They build a temporary church. And then we bring in Bertrand Villiger, who's the guy that's sort of our second founder that builds the Church of the Jesu. And so that's when they start really expanding. And there's a Girard College connection to that too, which is that they always were worried about Girard College. So I know Kathy Haas is the archivist at Girard College, but they were always worried that this godless organization had orphans and priests could not go into the campus, and it was free. So Felix Barblin opens initially a free college, reopens St. Joseph's College 1889 without tuition, and directly cites that Girard College had to do with it. He was also worried about taxes as well, but that's getting into the weeds. I'm sorry, I've talked too long. Any other,
Your biography of Father Barblin?
Yes, so Eleanor Donnelly wrote one in the 1800s, and she was a poet and very sentimental Catholic historian and writer. You can find that online as well. There's some copies around, but it's a very Victorian retelling. I am almost done writing a book right now for all of this. And I went back and tried to focus a lot on what Felix Barblin was doing. So hopefully you will have to get that. That's it. Yeah. One online.
Another question.
Yeah.
Online. You made a point that you were uncertain of the impact that the Civil War had on the creation of a post-bellum Catholic subculture. But do you have a view on the impact of the end of slavery on Philadelphia Catholics, particularly in terms of labor competition, which was a major theme in W.E.B. Boyce's 1899 classic, The Philadelphia Negro?
All right, well, so the question is, what did Catholics think? Well, they're online, so I don't have to restate. But yeah, I did look at Du Bois, especially because he did great history about the need for educational institutions for African-American children at the same time that St. Joe's was offering that. And I think that there was a need to establish their schools, but St. Joe's was often reluctant to get involved. There was a movement from Catherine Drexel in particular to entice the Jesuits to open another African-American school, and everybody was making those connections at the turn of the last century to Father Lilly, explicitly mentioning him, to Felix Barblin. The Jesuit that they sent to open a new Black school circa 1904 actually met with African-American Catholic families to discuss this and went into one of their houses and saw a portrait of Felix Barblin in their house. And noted that to say that there was a connection to all of that taking place. I think that the proof is in the pudding that they weren't really interested in getting involved in that later on. And they were afraid of Catherine Drexel, who was a good person to be afraid of. But they were afraid that if they took her money, they'd have to work for her. And that's what they said, but pretty much explicitly. Interestingly, St. Joseph's Hospital also did not take Catherine Drexel's money because she wanted to open a segregated unit at St. Joseph's Hospital, and they said, no, we already have an integrated institution. And if we take your money, then it's going to be a segregated institution. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I thought I saw a hand up. Nope, no.
Last question.
Yeah, maybe one more question. Yeah, sorry, you had your hand up earlier.
Okay. So I'm fascinated by this Thomas Lilly guy.
Yeah.
He's like Barblin's foot soldier.
Yeah.
He's the assistant pastor at Old St. Joe's. He, more than anybody else, is like the de facto chaplain for Black Catholics in the city.
Yeah.
It's he himself who spearheads the school, but he doesn't run the school. He gets the money, buys the property, but he's not teaching in that school. It's Ellen Woods.
Oh, yeah.
Can you say a little something about her?
Not so much. No, I can't.
From
You can go.
Pew Rent.
Oh, okay. Okay. This is a hot tip.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Old St. Joe's records, fantastic.
Yeah.
Not only do you have Lily's diaries that emerge from that cache of documents, you've got the Pew Rent, and that congregation was quite segregated. Black Catholics had their own mass at a certain time in the basement. A lot of great stuff happened in that basement.
Yeah, the basement, yeah.
But it's from that Mrs. Woods stands out, and Lily taps her as the headmistress of his.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. There's definitely more avenues to go down with Lily, for sure.
Sounds like a
And the
great
whole,
student project.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's the whole combination of racial perspectives from a Catholic perspective, of North and South allegiances, of whether he's a Democrat, what's the actual viewpoint. And yeah, I mean, and it's a tantalizing story because you have the college and the school starting at the same time, but that school did not continue, unfortunately, and sort of got absorbed in a way, but still, and had the encouragement of the bishop too. Yeah.
Can I add an addendum?
Yeah, yeah.
That's comment on pew rental, but in the 1830s at Old St. Joseph, the pew rental records indicate an integrated population on the main floor,
Mm.
especially among the refugees from San Domingue.
Mhm,
From San Domingo.
mhm, mhm,
So, and that, and by the 1840s and 50s, it's segregated.
mhm,
So there was a moment there where there was, I mean, it was whoever could pay for a funeral,
mhm,
whether you were black or white.
mhm, mhm.
And then segregation came in, as you move closer to the Civil War. There's definitely an influence on Old St. Joseph to rectify that, to change it.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, it's interesting. There's a lot more. This is just a sample. There's a lot more that we could do for sure. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stories and projects that we can build out of that. That's the nice part about it. You know, there's a lot of different corners.
When will the book come out?
Well, Bill's helping me edit it, so he's working his way through. Yeah, but thank you. I guess thank you again. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. You want to thank you. Let's get it. Now we're back now. Now we're in second. Yeah, I hope that's okay. Yeah, thank you. So,
On behalf of the society, I want to thank Leo for a really excellent presentation. We do have some liquid libations downstairs. You're welcome to them. Thank you so much for coming and have a good night.
yeah, thank you. Thank you.